Welcome to the Theoretical Neuroscience Podcast. I am the host, Gaut Einvoll. When computational neuroscientists think about learning and memory, the first thing that comes to mind is Hebbian plasticity, summarized in the saying, neurons that fire together wire together. According to this Hebbian theory, when a presynaptic neuron, say neuron A, repeatedly stimulates a postsynaptic neuron, neuron B, the efficiency of the synaptic connection between them increases. This means that the more often neuron A contributes to making neuron B fire, the stronger their synaptic connection becomes. Numerous computational studies have been done exploring how neuronal networks may learn and memorize, with the use of some kind of synaptic plasticity rule motivated by this idea. Here, the time scale for learning and memory is typically minutes, hours, or longer. But what about short term memory? For example, when you want to memorize a phone number for a few seconds when you dial your phone, or need to remember numbers while you do mental arithmetics. Here, the traditional view was that the different mechanism is used by the brain, where certain neurons in the areas such as the prefrontal cortex fires persistently during the few seconds that numbers are memorized. This mechanism was traditionally modeled via simple network models where temporarily stable bumps of neural firing activity could be made by combining spatially narrow recurrent excitation to make a local bump with a broader recurrent inhibition to prevent the bump from spreading out. But over the last 20 years or so, other models for short term memory have emerged, where different kinds of synaptic plasticity, both Hebbian and so called non Hebbian, have been at the core. Today's guest, Pawel Herman, a professor at KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, Sweden, has extensive experience in modeling short term memory. In the podcast, we talk about the history of short term memory studies, both experimental and theoretical, and discuss the various types of models that have been suggested. And could it be that the mechanism of short term and long term memory actually turn out to be very similar, just with different timescales? If you want to support the podcast, go to patreon.com/theoretical neuroscience podcast and choose a membership of your liking, for example, at the cost of $1 per month. As a member, you will get access to a video version of the podcast recordings, as well as transcripts of each episode. And note that there is a 7-day free trial period when you sign up. I will be most grateful if you become a Patreon supporter to help me fund the production of the podcast, even if you're not too interested in looking at the videos. But I also appreciate all the other listeners, and I hope that all of you can help spread the word about the podcast to other people in the community, on social media or otherwise. Okay, here is Pawel. So, welcome to the podcast, Pawel Herman.
Welcome. Thank you. Good morning.
Yeah. So, good morning. Good morning. You are. So, what are you? You're a professor in computer science at KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology, or something in Stockholm.
Yes. So it's in computational neuroscience or in neuroinformatics. Yes.
Neuroinformatics. Yeah. And we have met a few times this year. First on this boat where we sort of both were lecturing at this
Absolutely.
Nordic Baltic sort of school in neuroinformatics
Yes.
out in the Baltic Sea.
Which
So
was wonderful,
that
both
was
in
wonderful.
terms of the sort of interaction, scientific interaction, but also in terms of the experiences we got.
Absolutely. And last week I sort of visited to be Stockholm to be like an opponent in one of your PhD theses in your group.
Yes. Another nice opportunity. Yes.
Another nice opportunity. Yeah, I've always been a big fan of Nordic collaboration, and now also Nordic and Baltic collaborations. We people up in the north should stick together.
I wholeheartedly agree. Absolutely. Wholeheartedly.
And during this research school out in the Baltic Sea, you gave a very nice presentation, I think, on memory and including like short-term memory, which also has been sort of your specialty, right? I
Yes.
mean,
That's my
you've
focus.
worked a lot on models for short-term memory.
Yes. And in particular, working memory. Yes.
Yeah, working memory. Exactly. So let's start there. So what is the difference between short-term memory and working memory?
Oh, this is the question I think we should ask psychologists really, because
Okay,
they
yeah.
are very good at coming up with these different terms. Uh,
Okay.
if you look into the literature, I think the short-term memory people, when they talk about short-term memory, they put this in contrast to long-term memory, and this
Yeah.
is where it all starts.
Yeah.
And of course, short-term memory on its own, it could be used for purposes like very short-term storage of information, and some people would argue that's just an activation of long-term memory. So
Okay.
there's a whole debate, of course, behind
Yeah.
the differences there. But when we think about working memory, we more think about functionality,
Mm.
which is beyond just the storage of information, short-term information.
Okay.
So it's actually storing information that you can use, uh,
Okay.
information that you can guide your behavior. I would say that kind of
Okay.
goal-directed behavior aspect of memory, short-term, would be what working memory is really.
Mm. So in principle, it could be like aspect of short-term memory, which is not working memory, but it used for something else or
Yes,
something like that. Yeah.
yes. So people, they give this example that if you rehearse something in your brain for
Mm.
short-term use, but you don't use it to guide your behavior,
Mm.
uh, then you would say, oh, it's a use of short-term memory, but without working memory component.
Okay.
The moment you kind of use your memory to act, to perform behavior, to
Mm.
yes, to interact with the environment
Mm.
with some goal in mind, this is where the working memory is considered to be like operationally used.
Mm. I see. So yeah. Anyway, so this podcast is going to be about working memory and models for working memory. But maybe you should just give a quick recap about long-term memory. I think there where it's sort of more that is like people. Well, it's like has been more work maybe, or at least people know more about the long-term memory. And yeah, what is sort of the status there?
Yes, I mean, yes, I mean, obviously, memory has attracted a lot of attention, right? Obviously,
Mm.
because it's very interesting from the perspective of our cognition.
Yeah.
And in terms of long-term memory, there has been quite a lot of studies, as you mentioned. A lot of effort has been driven through psychologists. So
Mm.
it's something which is more easy to more easily tap in, right? Because you
Mm.
can. There are different types of memory. We store, facts. We store episodes of our lives under the
Mm.
umbrella of episodic memories.
Yeah.
So then you have, declarative memories, procedural memories for
Mm.
actions. So various sorts of different type of storage of information,
Mm.
heavily studied. And then, of course, one thing is the function. The other thing is the colocalization of long-term memory. And there also have been studies where you can intervene with different parts of the, parietal cortices. And then you can, try to affect your behavior, affect your memory performance.
Mm.
So there's been much more work done on colocalization of memory than, for example, in terms of short-term memory or working
It's a
memory.
co-localization. What is that?
I mean, localization, sorry.
Localization, exactly.
Localization. So it's
Where it
either
is sort of,
pinning
yeah,
down the circuitry that would be
yeah.
responsible for. And of course, you have a plethora of work historically, under the synaptic plasticity that would go into the mechanisms of
Mm.
storing this memory. And as you know, one of the most dominant theories there is the synaptic doctrine of long-term
Mm.
memory. Quite well established, actually.
Yeah. The long-term synaptic plasticity,
Yes,
exactly.
yes,
That is sort of where things are
yes,
stored. And I guess also associated with this is sort of like this D from Donald Hebb, with his cell assemblies, and
yes,
that is like this fire together, wire together.
yes,
Which are sort of like the psychological ID maybe first, and which then was sort of found later,
yes,
actually here in Oslo. So I'm proud to
yes,
mention that with this
absolutely,
Blist and Lømo, this
absolutely.
long-term synaptic plasticity.
Very influential work, absolutely very important in this field by all means,
Mm.
because it really established, I would say, our understanding of what memory could be, how it
Mm.
could be realized or implemented in actual neural circuits.
Mm. So okay, so long-term memory is sort of things that you would like to remember for for a long time, right? When you study for an exam or study to learn something that you need to use in your life,
Yes,
you want to be able to, some sense, often at some, I mean, some things you want to be able to remember for the rest of your life, right?
yes,
And
yes,
something you do remember for the rest of your life, maybe like the first day at school, maybe, or other sort of like emotionally loaded episodes.
Yes,
Uh,
very good point.
but uh, but short term or working memory. Let's talk about working memory. So that the goal of the working memory is different. There, you just want to keep something in your mind, maybe for a few seconds. I think there isn't a standard example. If you sort of get like the telephone number from like telephone information, whatever, if you call someone or get a telephone number, you just want to keep this whatever 8 or 10 digits in your head until you dial the number yourself, and then you want to forget it, right? So that is sort of so. What is sort of like when you talk about working memory? What are the time scales you're talking about?
Yeah, so we're talking about typically seconds, seconds up to minutes max. So
Mm,
again, there are different ideas in the field of what would count as a working memory. Some
mm,
people would claim, for example, that if there is a certain amount of memory that you need to remember for a little bit longer time, then you go into this mode of they call it supra memory. So then you have to actually offload some of your work, so-called shorter memory, into MTL, like hippocampus and so on. And
MTL, what's that? That's
that's medial temporal lobe,
yeah, okay.
right?
Yeah.
But I would say working memory in typical daily tasks, this would span seconds, tens of seconds, minutes, maybe max.
So it's also that one thing is that you need to sort of load the memory within a few seconds, right? Or essentially immediately, right?
Even quicker than that.
Even quicker than that, exactly. And then, but also when you sort of when you've used the short term, like the telephone number you need to dial, it sort of vanishes. So if you ask me a minute afterwards, I probably have forgotten it, right? So
Well,
this,
I mean, again, if you, for example, go and you drink coffee, right? Do nothing
yeah.
more. You just maybe don't go into active mental mode. Maybe you
Mhm.
remember that because again, there are ideas that the actual,
Mhm.
other tasks, other needs demand
Mhm.
for working memory. This is the mechanism that would wipe out your previous information.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Exactly. So it's sort of this idea that you write on top of the working memory.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
So you're saying if you were sitting maybe in a dark room and the only thing you got were like 10 digits and nothing else happened, then you would remember these 10 digits.
Who knows?
This is this is an experiment.
A torture.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. So okay. So then. I think, I mean, about this working memory, which has well, it sort of is the sort of story. The first story you hear about working memory is these stories from like the measurements in the prefrontal cortex, I guess, from
Yes,
monkeys in the 70s and 80s and 90s with people like I guess it was this Fuster and
yes,
also Goldman Rakic and
yes,
maybe Funahashi and Kubota and so on.
yes. A lot of work in Japan. Yes.
Yeah. So what's the story there about the that was sort of like the as I understand it, like the basic experiments
Yes.
regarding this what's called persistent activity.
Yes. So maybe let's go back because you mentioned it's the first kind of interest. We should go back probably to Baddeley and Hitch first to talk about more phenomenological aspects of memory, right? So
By all means, yeah, please do.
they build this kind of beautiful model of working memory, of course, purely phenomenological. And
Mm,
their idea was that working memory is used for visual spatial memory. So if you have remember something in the visual field, but also they thought about the working memory as being absolutely instrumental for our communication. So they
mhm.
had this phonological loop, and they thought, if you have this visual
A
spatial,
phonological loop. What does that mean?
so it's a kind of it's a buffer that that allows you to go over like the symbols, phonological symbols,
Mm,
that engages your speech,
okay.
but
Mhm.
on a symbolic level.
Yeah.
So they argued that you have these components, and then you have some local storage together with executive function that controls what is used when, and they thought this is like a working memory. So they had a very functional perspective on this.
So this is more in the traditional sort of like the cognitive science field
Yes,
when you
yes.
look for do you call this connectionist models or no?
So that's also interesting because there's the how people refer to connectionist models. Some people would call connectionist models as being connected boxes.
Okay.
And again, it's like he has a long
Okay.
history in psychology, cognitive neuroscience. But nowadays, I think, and that's yet not so very clear. Some people would use connectionist models also when referring to network models.
Yeah, I think so. The connectionist sort of a tradition, sort of, was starting with, I mean, or at least I was revamped in the 80s in the
Yes,
Rumelhart and
yes,
Hinton and these people. That's also called connectionist.
yes, yes. And I kind of like
That's
that. I prefer that
okay.
definition, and I use it myself.
Okay, so then
Maybe
we
to
go
annoy
back
to
to
my
sort of
colleagues.
like, so cognitive models. Maybe that's a
I mean, it's
cognitive
better.
model.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. So this was like a basic cognitive model, but soon they also realized that that this information is not only used to memorize some objects in the visual spatial field
Mm,
or domain or to talk, but it's also actually it's an information that you use for other tasks, and most importantly, it's available even though the sensory evidence is gone. So, for example, when you observe something, then
mm,
obviously you activate, specific hierarchies in your in your cortex. But
mm,
when it's gone, then all of a sudden, according to this notion that it's the stimulus drives your memory,
mm,
it should disappear. But we know it does not,
mm.
and that gave rise to a lot of experiments. They were trying to look for these neural correlates of the
So,
information.
so what time was this roughly?
So we're talking about 70s,
70s?
70s, 80s, yes.
Mm,
So there was a lot of interest in trying to figure out, okay, so what are the neural correlates of information that no longer is available through senses?
mm,
But it must be there because we use it.
mm,
And this actually, yes, was studied heavily in monkeys. So this is the trend that you mentioned, the authors you
mm,
mentioned, Fuster, Goldman Rakic, yes, people in
mm.
Japan, Kubota.
Yeah, but then yeah, exactly. But then it was not, then it wasn't like a cognitive, then it was down more like a neuroscience studies
This
more
was
than,
down to neuroscience, yes,
yeah.
yes, yes. But yet it was performed in a very neat experiment because they set monkey in front of the screen, they showed some objects, and then the monkey was supposed to, after some delay period when the visual stimuli was gone,
Mm,
the monkey was obviously supposed to remember this for a second or two, and after that act on this. So in some
mm,
sense, they of course the task was built in a way that the stimulus was no longer available, but yet monkey had
mm,
to keep it in memory for a certain task. And then the whole era of studying this delay period, this famous delay period. So this is the period where the information is not available on the screen,
mm,
but yet it's supposed to be maintained by the brain activity somehow.
And maybe like a second or so, or a few seconds, or a fraction
Yes,
of a
it
sec.
started from experiments. People were a bit concerned. It was like half a second,
Mm,
whether you can breach that. But then later on, it went actually even up to like 2 or 3 seconds.
okay. With these monkeys sitting there
Yes,
and recalling,
yes,
yeah.
yes,
Mm,
yes. And to their initial surprise, the monkeys could perform tasks very, very well,
mhm,
despite the fact that they had this couple of second gap in seeing the
mm,
stimulus. Uh,
mm. Why? I'm not quite sure. I'm surprised that this was surprising. Not
Oh,
that I
well,
had.
maybe not surprising, but the
Yeah.
tasks were not so easy
Yeah.
later on.
Okay.
So yes, of course, the monkeys were well trained.
Yeah. Mm. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah. Okay. So
And
that's.
yes,
Mhm.
so then of course the whole era of person activity started really
Mm.
because people saw when they recorded, they saw that there is a group of population of neurons that tend to fire.
Mm.
Um,
During when the monkey has to wait and what have to well, during the delay time where the
yes,
monkey has to remember there are certain neurons that
yes,
are firing all the time.
yes,
And
yes,
this
yes.
and that's persistent activity.
And that's person activity because the idea would be that they have to persistently fire throughout that period to bridge
Hmm.
the gap, right? So you
Yeah.
have stimulus disappear, but the firing goes on
Hmm.
until the sort of task instructions show up, and then you can use that information that you stored in these firing neurons.
Hmm.
So that was the original idea behind persistent activity.
Mm. And and then I think I mean there are two prime classes of candidate models for working memory, as I've understood from reading some of your papers and some review papers. And one is sort of like this, what's it called, recurrent network models without any synaptic plasticity. And then there are some models that involves synaptic plasticity. So what we want to do here, I'm first going to go through, I would say, like the classic models, which are sort of, I think the first is recurrent activity models,
Yes,
which I think it seemed to me that they were sort of quite dominant and almost alone and until sort of year 2000 or
yes.
so. So what are I mean, so this, of course, in 1980 or in the 80s, early 80s, you got these Hopfield models for associative memory.
Yes.
So maybe you can, well, brief me, well, because one idea was that this working memory could sort of correspond to sort of, some sense, temporarily putting the system in one of these states stored in a Hopfield-like network, right?
Yes.
Maybe you could just briefly go through this idea with the Hopfield memory and
Absolutely.
how the working memory can sort of can work
Yes. So
within the
maybe
context.
first we should just mention, the ideas that were also quite influential
Okay.
earlier on in 50s already.
Hmm.
The ideas of how the memories actually are manifested in the brain, and then we go back, of course, to long-term memory because this was like
Yeah.
more heavily studied. The
Perfect.
idea was that in the brain we have these populations of neurons. Obviously, we now have neurons, but the memories are really like the engrams or as assemblies. So this is like
Engrams. Yeah, that's another thing. That's another word.
yeah.
There's
So
like an
people
old word.
they use different words. They use engrams or assemblies. Sometimes they mean the same thing. Sometimes they mean different things. But
Yeah.
loosely speaking, this is a population of neurons, typically distributed, that tend to coactivate. So they synchronously or in a correlated manner they
Mm,
activate, and this correlated activity is supposed to sort of operationally
mm,
encode memory.
mm.
So if you have a
But
certain population of neurons activating, that's a certain memory or mental object.
this, I mean, there's also another. I mean, when I think about engram, from what I've sort of heard from the people talked about, it's sort of like the, if you remember, sort of like the particular object or something. The engram of that object is sort of the like the neural, whatever, the neural system, the neural subsystem that is involved, or the neurons that are involved in sort of making this memory come back or something. The neurons involved in storing this memory is.
Yes, yes. But of course, it's always hard to kind of find the direct link between, let's say, the stimulus space, so, the world that
Mm,
surrounds us, the memory
mm,
content, semantic of memory, and the, let's say, interpretation of the features of this memory
absolutely.
by
Mm,
individual neurons.
of course. Mm,
So there
yeah.
have been different
Because,
sort of ideas behind this, but I think ultimately we would agree that yes, there are some population of neurons, and they tend to coactivate, and that would, as you said, be kind of a footprint
mm,
of that memory. And whether
yeah.
these are the features
Okay.
or whatever, different story.
Perfect. Okay. Now I'm. So now, yeah. Perfect. Go on.
So once we have the cell assembly, right?
Mm,
The question, of course, is how to embed, how to build this association between the neurons so that they would actually tend to correlate activity. And then this is something that Hebb proposed in 50s or even earlier than that. Is that there actually, there are some local learning rules based on this famous term of firing together and wiring together. So if the neurons tend to fire together, then they tend to strengthen their connections.
mm,
So that was his idea, that by repetitive experience, you can strengthen the connection between neurons and then build those cell assemblies that later on can be activated.
mm,
So in the beginning, this was kind of an idea of a more long-term memory storage earlier. But of course, Hebb thought about this also in terms of working memory, short-term memory, or later on, one of his kind of more seminal work points to that direction. But Hopfield picked up on this. So he was the computer scientist who picked up on this, and he built actually I would say probably the first mathematical instantiation of
mm,
this Hebbian learning.
mm,
And as you pointed out, so in his network he had like the recurrently connected neurons, but there were different cell assemblies were embedded in those in these recurrently connected neurons. They were more strongly connected groups of neurons. So basically, in a pool of neurons, you had then multiple populations that would be more strongly recurrently connected with each other,
mm,
and these would be cell assemblies.
mm,
And then by activating certain subpopulation, they would, reactivate the full cell assembly.
mm,
That was an idea, and of course that led to the whole family of so-called attractor-based models.
mm,
So these are energy-based models where the limit or the minimum energy wells would correspond to those fixed point
mm.
attractors.
Yeah. Energy is sort of like a more abstract concept. It's not physical energy.
It's
It's sort
abstract
of,
concept
yeah,
here. Yes,
it's
yes,
actually
yes,
like this.
yes,
Yeah. So then with this Hopfield model, sort of very elegantly showed sort of how you can sort of, for example, store several items in memory. So if you sort of have like maybe an apple, orange, banana. So if you showed an apple, you ended up with an like with a well in the apple attractor of the cell assembly, and then and the same for the banana or an orange, and so on. So it was sort of like a discrete set of memories.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes,
And then of course then the Hopfield models, at least or the simplest ones are in terms of like, well, it's firing rate models, even sometimes even simpler than that, very simple, sort of like stylized neurons.
yes,
Then I think there was some interesting work by an impressive work by Amit and Brunel,
yes,
where they implemented this idea in more sort of like more biologically realistic, presumably spiking neural models. So in spikes and action potential as spikes in not only firing rates, and with both excitatory and inhibitory neurons.
yes, yes, yes. So as you said, the whole idea of building the cell assemblies came from Hebb. It was shown in Hopfield, very simple, as you said, abstract network that would
Mhm.
work. It had very nice dynamical, very rich dynamics,
And this beautiful energy function that really
beautiful energy
showed
function, yes.
showed
And
why you.
dynamics also had, interesting features that some people would connect to other psychophysical experiments with memories, so would link very well, like this memory completion things and so on, resistance to noise. But on the other hand, as you pointed out, would also have very nice dynamics, and the dynamics was reflected in what people thought would correspond very well to this persistent activity we talked about before.
Mm,
So that
yeah,
was the bridge, really.
yeah.
This dynamical reverberation of the circuit,
Mm.
recurrent reverberation of the circuit, that would give rise to this persistent activity observed during the delay period.
And then it was sort of, and so the way to think about working memory then was that you somehow gave this whatever, this Apple thing, and then Apple stimulus, and then you sort of put this network into this Apple state, and then after some time, maybe a few seconds then or whatever, when you didn't need the working memory anymore, then maybe something else filled you the network was put into another kind of state, or
Yes,
maybe just or
yes,
lost
yes.
its memory.
Yes, and as you said, Amit Brunel, they made a fantastic contribution to the field because indeed they translated this Hopfield idea of recurrent
Mm,
network
mm,
into biophysical models. And of course, they
mm,
encountered a lot of problems there, but their contribution has really been to overcome these problems and show how
mm,
biophysically plausible substrate can
mm.
implement this idea.
Maybe I can just mention there that, I mean, as I mentioned earlier on this podcast, I was involved in writing this second edition of this Principles of Computational Modeling in Neuroscience, which I think is a nice textbook to use in a
Mhm.
computational neuroscience course. And there actually this the contributions of Amit and Brunel and how is sort of described uh, quite sort of pedagogically, I think. So this
Yes,
is a source for this.
yes. So
So yeah.
let's send them the listeners to those book because indeed it's very nicely described there.
Yeah. So so see, so this sort of, I also saw that this in their Amit and Brunel model, they saw that I mean there were some neurons that fired only during presentation of the stimulus, or yeah, and some only during the delay period, and some during whatever, yeah, during. So that was sort of similar to what is often seen in like in real animals, right?
Yes, yes, yes. Here we should also say that the recording, the approach people used to take to analyze the data because of the limitations in recording capacity,
Mm,
forced people to do a lot of averaging. A
okay.
lot of all the data what we see today, it's also through the prism of averaging. So in fact, you do the spatial temporal averaging, so you don't always get a very nice picture of how things look on single trials.
Hmm.
But yes, collectively, statistically, if you look across trials, you average, you see these groups of neurons that that tend to behave different in different parts of the trial. Yes, and Amit Brunel nicely mapped it. And actually, there was a lot of interesting, challenging issues they had to overcome to demonstrate this, because obviously in a classical reverberation recurrent circuit, everything kind of goes into this up state.
Yeah, exactly. So what's the up state then? That's sort of when. Yeah. Exactly. Well, now we're getting a little bit more technical, but this network can typically be in like the background state where there's little firing, and then the up state, which is like many more neurons firing. But for this to work, it should be, at least if you want to store more. Yeah, okay. So if you only want to store one thing in the network, then you could sort of have like everyone going up to the up state, and that would be like well, and that would be like the storage for this one particular item. But if
Yes.
you want to have more than one thing, then you need more than one thing stored in this network. Then you have to do something more clever, right?
Yes. So I mean, first of all, of course, so classical bistability, right? You have two states. You have this, I said background state, stable background state where there's no clear population of neurons that tend to fire more than others. And then you would have the other foreground state where either all neurons fire, the higher level. That was the kind of very early models. And then the later models where there was again some subpopulation of neurons that would tend to fire, have higher firing rates. So if you wanted to store multiple items, obviously you could have different population of neurons being active. Now, the problem is that kind of notion with persistent memory would only work where you, in a given trial, you only work with one item.
Yeah.
So you
Okay.
have this banana, apple, and pear, but in a given trial, there's only apple or banana or pear.
Okay. Yeah.
Because you cannot reactivate them together, because they will
Oh, I
start
see. Yeah.
interacting and there will be a lot of superposition
Because in
problems.
some multi-item task, you want to say the monkey to first respond or memorize a sequence of say two
Yes.
stimuli,
Yes.
a pair of first banana, then apple, and storing these two items at the same time in the network
Yes.
is difficult.
Yes. And that has proven to be the challenge for most of the persistent activity models,
Okay.
by all means.
Yeah.
So there's been some ideas to sparsify the connectivity. For example, in more continuous attractor models, like the so-called bump attractor models, you could try to make the activity very sparse, or distribute this activity spatially in the network far away from each other so they wouldn't interact. But it's problematic. It's not robust. It does not work too well. So
This, yeah. No, now I just read that like this. I think in the at least in the simplest spiking networks, like with like something we often call the Brunel network, or the simplest sort of like two population networks, you often only consider AMPA receptors. But it seemed like for this sort of to be NMDA receptors seems to be important to get to make this delay sort of the persistent activity thing work
yes,
and be more robust against sort of kind of distractors and noise and stuff?
yes, there were different ideas. So early days, people had this recurrent activity in a population of the spiky neurons, and it was mainly the idea was driven by the fact that they were recurrently reverberating. So this was really like a classical bistable state. So you have the low firing, you have high firing. One of the problem was that it was very hard to get statistics of neurons firing that would be in line with electrophysiological recordings. So there had to be a lot of effort put into together tuning the system so that would be behaving in a stable way. And then people realized indeed that maybe actually by adding, by considering AMPA and MDA receptors, specific NMDA with longer time constants, you can actually make that more robust. And that's absolutely true. So sometimes we talk about synaptic basis of persistent model.
I see.
And another idea was also that maybe neurons themselves, they have this bistability. So it's not a network phenomenon, but it's individual neurons that go on and off.
Yeah.
So this different kind of line of thinking led to sort of different and more or less plausible systems. And when we talk about plausibility, typically it boils down to how realistic are parameters of these models.
Mm. Yeah. Mm. Exactly. But this idea of sort of like whether a thing is happening at the single neuron level, at the network level, that is often like a question
Yes,
in many aspects when you do this, try to make sense of uh, of this. Well, when you try to make models of different neuroscience
absolutely,
phenomena. Yeah.
absolutely.
So anyway, and there's also some idea that some neuromodulators like dopamine can help.
Yes, so we know that dopamine has a strong effect on memory, specifically working memory. Can enhance working memory, specifically, in multiple different tasks, of course. And it's been shown also that dopamine increases sort of the activity of an NMDA receptors.
I
So
see.
the efficacy of an NMDA receptor. So that's been shown. This connection between dopamine and NMDA has been shown as one of the important drivers for the synaptic basis of whatever working memory models we're talking about.
Mm.
Right? Because we're
Also,
still kind of in the domain of this persistent model, persistent models.
mm,
So it's also, I think, important to realize that sometimes we forget about this. That indeed this AMPA and NMDA interaction, synaptic interaction, is also still very important for those reverberating circuits, and this is where the dopamine comes in and helps stabilize things.
because this persistent activity is, I mean, it's as like well, I mean, it's very prominent in the prefrontal cortex, right, above our eyes.
Yes,
Uh,
yes.
but it's also other places, or that you see this, or
Yeah, so generally speaking, person activity has been a phenomenon seen in different types of cortices, in motor cortex, sensory motor cortex, but these are lower order cortices.
mm,
So it's
yeah,
yeah. Some people would argue that working memory is very distributed phenomenon, so that would
mm.
kind of count as part of the substrate. Uh, but I wouldn't necessarily strictly consider this to be this the same kind of aspect of working memory as we would observe in prefrontal cortex.
So the persistent activity that you see, say, in like motor cortex could be sort of like actually reflecting something else,
I
maybe.
think so. I think it could. I think it could.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
necessarily think it must reflect
Mm,
strictly sort of the delay kind of activity,
mm.
though
I
it
guess.
could be linked, of course,
Yeah.
correlated.
Sure. Yeah. I also read that there's more NMDA receptors in the prefrontal cortex, or at least
Yes,
that has
there
been
is
claimed.
actually.
So maybe that's sort of a hint of whatever, that
Yes,
NMDA receptors are important to get this persistent activity. And
yes.
then there's also this idea of reservoir computing. You know, that is sort of like this memory sort of reverberates around in the reservoir for a
Yes,
while until it can sort of, so that the information stays there for many seconds.
yes, yes. So again, it's also reflecting the same type of thinking that the manifestation of memory during the delay period has to be the activity, some form of neural activity.
Mm,
And the difference here is that we have these dynamical trajectories. So it's a more dynamical system. In
mm,
classical persistent memory, we have this population of neurons that elevated their activity and kept their activity throughout the delay period, or they switch somehow. Now, in reservoir computing, the idea would be that we have a dynamical trajectory. So it's really like a low dimensional state. So you have population of neurons that in some spatial temporal pattern get activated across the delay period. It's quite complex in the sense that you would have to have a lot of these different spatial temporal trajectories, and they would all store different memories. That was kind of an idea behind this.
mm,
I would say it's less mathematically elegant. It's harder to tackle this, but
mm.
sure, it's been used now for some of the cognitive studies.
Yeah. Talk about mathematical elegance these days when you train these deep networks. That ship has sailed. Well, it's sort of elegant in its own way, but it's a it's a different thing.
I shared your yes. I sympathize with your reflection. Yes,
So anyway, uh, I mean, so far we talked about, I guess, attractors that are sort of like, for instance, point attractors. You remember apple or an orange or but they're, or banana, whatever. But there are also something. I mean, like these continuum attractors, like line attractors, where you sort of, for example, if you want to have this, if you want, like, I think the most prominent or well-known example is this head direction networks, where
yes,
what you want to code in is the direction of your head, and that's not a discrete thing in principle. it's a continuous thing.
Yes. So maybe we should start actually before we go to line attractors. Maybe it's easier to imagine this continuous attractor models like bump attractor models.
Okay.
Because the reason I think it's easier because it's easier to connect them to memory.
Okay.
So
Go ahead.
imagine if we go to bodily ideas, right? That you have
Yeah.
visual, spatial, scratch pad. Imagine that you have to remember some positions on the screen, like you have some dots. Like typically monkeys would be shown dots, and they would have to remember where these dots are.
Mm-hmm.
So in these memories, these are kind of we would say that you need to remember a continuous variable
Mm.
because the location is a continuous variable. So it's no
Exactly.
longer like a discrete set of attractors, but you
Mm.
need to somehow remember that specific location.
Yeah. So that's in some sense, if you think of the visual field, it's sort of like you need to remember a position in a 2D plane, two-dimensional
Yes,
plane. Yeah.
yes. So you map this two-dimensional space
Mm-hmm.
outside, that you observe. You have to match it somehow to the dynamics of your brain.
Mm-hmm.
The idea would be that you would have a cortical sheet, and in this cortical sheet you would have population of neurons that got activated in a spatial manner,
Mm-hmm.
meaning that in this two-dimensional sheet you would have basically locations where the corresponding groups of neurons would elevate their activity as a response to a specific location in the screen.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the notion of this continuous attractors,
Mm-hmm.
very
Yeah.
prominent in visual spatial memory,
Yeah.
working memory.
Yeah, and I guess this has quite a long history. I think some back to this old work of from the early 70s,
Yes,
Wilson and Cowan
absolutely.
and Amari
Yes,
in Japan, working on sort of like was it like neural field models? We call them that today,
yes,
uh, for how you sort of these bumps, like so you can get these stable bumps. And
yes,
we actually did some of that kind of work. Well, similar kind of models. We studied that. Some time ago. So yeah, I have some experience with that. So that's sort of like, and I guess yeah. So then the idea, I guess, with this bump attractor models, at least the oldest one, is that you have like this short range recurrent excitations, so which makes you sort of like it's like keep so that you sort of recruit your neighbors to make sort of like some kind of joint excitation, so you actually fire, and then you have some long range recurrent inhibition so that it doesn't sort of spread away and takes up the whole cortex. And I think you often have this like Mexican hat
yes.
like
Connectivity.
connectivity, and so
Yes,
this gives sort of like a specially localized bump of activity.
yes.
Mm.
I would say that probably the major criticism is that indeed this connectivity that you mentioned, very specific connectivity, it's not so straightforward to think, from the perspective of learning, how you learn this
No.
connectivity. Some people
Yeah.
would argue that it's there as a substrate that you just use. Um, but yes, there's been a lot of criticism, and also the stability is the problem. So you need to introduce a lot of different mechanisms to make sure it's stable.
Mm.
Uh,
Yeah.
but it's a
Because
nice model, sure.
But also, it was sort of observed in this. I think there was this really cool paper that came out of Janili Farm a few years ago, where they sort of observed this sort of like almost like this, these ring models in the fly, I think in the fruit fly, which sort of actually a set of neurons on the ring. I think that actually that sort of well sort of coded for these head erections of these flies. So it has sort of it's sort of a it's sort of like really a sort of kind of textbook kind of thing that you have this, because you can describe it with relatively simple firing rate models and how you can get this sort of like continuous attractor on a ring, right? That you
Yes,
can be
yes.
any place on this.
Yes, I think it's a general idea. I would say probably beyond memory, you have some low dimensional behavior, and
Mm,
you have high dimensional activity of neurons. So
yeah.
somehow they have to represent this low dimensional behavior, and one
Mm,
of the attractive theoretical frameworks would be attractors. That indeed you have that these groups of neurons, they have collectively stable states, and they arranged along some abstract low dimensional structure, like a line.
mm.
Um,
But they shouldn't be frozen either, right? Because then you couldn't. So it needs to be able to sort of move the bump around,
yes,
maybe with some kind of inputs.
yes,
So
Yes,
it's sort of so you have to find a balance between, I guess, stability and avoiding drift and stuff.
yes, yes,
And yeah, so
yeah, yeah.
that's
So the system is in some state indeed, and then you have the input, and the idea would be that you just move to a next or to another state. And of course, in line attractors, the idea would be that you move along a very specific trajectory in this high-dimensional activity space. So there's like a predetermined way that the neurons change their activity. And as you said, there are a lot of problems because they are very susceptible to drift. So if you the more you integrate activity from the input, the more you go away from this kind of attractor.
yeah.
And these sort of problems. But I would not necessarily say they are strictly memory related.
Okay.
You mentioned head direction cells, right?
Yeah.
So this is type of a memory, I would
Yeah.
agree, but it's
Yeah.
more of memory operational for a specific sort of
That's
task
true.
here, motor
Yeah.
task.
That's true. So it's yeah, I don't know how it is, how maybe you don't have this very delay, this delay feature is maybe not so prominent there. The main thing is that you need to know where right now
Yes, yes,
where your head is pointing, not that
yes.
you need to remember it for a few seconds.
Like in a sense, of course, if the animal is still, right,
Yeah.
you need to remember that, but you're in that position. So you have this
Yeah.
population of neurons firing, and you're right, it's not
Mm,
strictly delay because the
mm,
animal is in this position, motor position.
yeah.
It's not like it's mentally away or stimulus is gone or something.
Mm. There's also this alternative of like synfire chains, which is sort of like this and I guess an idea that has been around for quite some time. I guess like Moshe Abelus is one of the has been one of the like the one of the people who suggested that. So what's synfire chains and how can they in principle work or store memories?
Yes. So far we've been talking about recurrent networks. So the
Mm,
networks that can reverberate activity in the circuitry, like in Hopfield model, and that would give rise to this persistent activity. And
mm,
again, this persistence, again, we should go back to the recordings. The way we observed this, or the people, the way they observed in the past was that they averaged a lot of activity, that they saw this population of neurons being active. Well, if you have different structure in different network structure, by averaging, you could also see similar activity in so-called synfire chains. And what is synfire chain? It's basically a cascade of populations of neurons that pass on the activity.
mm,
So you have one. It's almost, you can think about this as the feed-forward structure. You have layers of neurons, population of neurons, and they successively pass on the highly synchronous activity from one population to another one. So it's like a chain of activity. You have
mm.
one population active, bam. Then you have some delay, another activity, another population gets active, and so on. So in some sense, you could think of this as a substrate for holding memory because you have some activity kept by a population of neurons in a more synchronous wave style.
But then it would sort of at some point come back to itself, right?
Yes, so
It
you
does
could
have to
actually,
be a loop or
yes,
something.
you can make the loop, then you can create kind of feed-forward recurrent network.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yes.
like
So
so
they
it's
can
like
kind of loop around. Absolutely,
yeah,
yes.
so that it sort of can stay there as long as the yeah, so it can in principle sort of run this loop as many times
Yes,
as it
yes.
needs to.
Yes, but theoretically, of course, to be able to find evidence for this, you need to show quite demanding statistics for correlated activity, for synchronous activity, because they
Mm,
rely on quite synchronous activity. And there have been loads of ideas, of course, how to collect these statistics from very limited, experimental capabilities that we have in terms of recording from many neurons,
mm,
but also, of course, how to maintain this synchronous activity without the whole system going epileptic.
mm,
Uh,
mm.
so
Huh.
lots of different ideas put in together. So it's one alternative in the field. I would say probably less robust than what we thought of recurrent networks as the substrate for persistent activity.
Mm,
I would say probably they need more care
mm,
to have this stability. Let's say.
mm. So I mean these I mean this kind I mean you come from I guess you took your I mean you worked with Anders Lanser, maybe that was part of
Yes.
your
Yes.
PhD.
Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah.
No. No. Not
So I
PhD. I was a postdoc with
oh,
Anders.
postdoc anyway.
Yes.
Yeah. So so of course I remember when I mean Anders is I guess is still a professor,
Yes,
maybe called emeritus or something. I don't know
yes,
how it works
yes.
in
Sitting
Sweden.
next room.
Sitting next room, very good. So bring my regards
We
because
say
I
hello
remember
to Anders. Yes.
so yes, because I remember when I talked to him. Well, this is like 20 years ago. So he had this sort of these ideas of that this instead of this persistent, well, this sort of like this recurrent networks ID, maybe he had some other ideas regarding synaptic plasticity. So that sort of I guess that is the kind of models that you, for example, have worked mostly on. So so maybe we can start with I think uh, some of these sort of like the models we have talked about in this recurrent network thing can sort of be a recurrent network ID can be sort of aided a little bit by some kind of short-term plasticity here and there. Uh, but but what is the like major you think limitations of this recurrent network ID? I guess one thing is that typically they assume a fixed synaptic structure, so there's no plasticity. It's typically connectivity, a fixed connectivity that makes this recurrent network work, right?
Yes, of course. Though, as we mentioned, there is a lot of short-term plasticity.
Okay.
Like you mentioned, an MDA, right, dependent,
Mm,
that helps keep certain balance in these
mm.
networks.
Yeah.
In the classical recurrent. But I think that the major distinction we should maybe make not it's not the recurrence, I would say, but more the idea of persistent activity.
Okay.
Because the question, of course, appears: what is that stores that information during the delay period?
Mm,
And the whole persistent activity camp, as we discussed before,
mm.
maintains that this is activity of neurons.
Okay.
Now, there's been several lines of experiments demonstrating that actually during the delay period,
Yeah.
the persistent activity is not necessary for the information to survive.
Okay.
And that is actually, I would think, the beginning of the story of synaptic memory, because it points out that maybe the actual substrate for storing information is not the activity of neurons in this
Mm,
recurrent circuit, but
mm,
maybe it's something else. And the obvious candidate, as we learned, of course, from the long-term memory, are synapses.
mm. Synaptic plasticity,
So
some
this
kind of.
is the whole, yes, this is where the whole, new class of models known
Mm,
under the umbrella of synaptic working memory models, this is
mm,
where they originate, from this idea that it's not the activity of neurons, but the synaptic potentiation or some sort of a synaptic
mm,
changes that store information
mm. But
during
I
the delay
thought sort
period.
of like this persistent activity, that's sort of like in experiments, that's sort of like a very nice and clear sort of hallmark of working memory. But you say that there are also experiments showing that you don't need this kind of persistent activity.
Yes, so we should also say that a lot of recordings. So if you look back into, as I said, 70s and so on, a lot of data that we see today, this been average data, right? So across
Mm.
trials, you do see that you get this nice elevated activity of average firing rates.
Uh-huh.
The question is what happens on a single trial.
Okay.
Another thing is that there's been, of course, more recent experiments also demonstrating some form of persistent activity, but typically in like experiments where you have only one memory to store, with short delay periods, and then you
Mm,
see, of course, hallmarks of persistent activity.
mm,
Also, there's been discussion about what actually these neurons in PFC reflect in specific tasks like visual spatial tasks, where the translation between the memory and the action of your saccade and so on maybe requires this continuous modulation. And maybe what we see in this recording is not pure delay activity of memory, but maybe actually it's a motor program being prepared and so on.
mm,
So there's been a lot of discussion about I would say, about the substrate of person activity in terms of recordings.
mm,
How credible the evidence is, how well we can attach that evidence to delay period. I'm absolutely convinced there are still population of neurons that will behave like this,
mm,
but it's not just that it's absolutely necessary in working memory task.
mm. Good. So actually, now I see that this Norwegian winter's low sun in the Norway in the north is actually getting in my face. So I'm just going to have a little can have a little break while I put up some shadow or
Absolutely.
fix the situation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, then we just continue in a few in a sec.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, I think the stage now is set for like you finally can talk about your specialty and how like the synaptic plasticity can help sort of facilitating and make working memory. And I guess there are different types of synaptic plasticity,
There
but
are.
let's start with the Hebbian synaptic plasticity, which then, of course, then it has to be faster than maybe the normal whatever the Hebbian
Yes.
plasticity that people are most familiar with. But let's just start with what is Hebbian synaptic plasticity.
Yes. So we go back actually now to the long-term memory. The
Yeah.
idea of Hebbian plasticity, and specifically, as you mentioned, in working memory, has to be fast. So that's why we say fast Hebbian plasticity comes from the original thoughts about the substrate of long-term memory. So if you remember in the very beginning, we talked about Bliss Lomo's work on long-term potentiation.
Mhm.
And this actually was is an example of Hebbian plasticity. So Hebbian implies, and we go now to the more conceptual understanding of the term we also used before, which was that if the neurons fire together, they wire together. So
Mhm.
that implies that if there is some coactivity, correlate activity between neurons, then the connection between them, synapse between them, gets potentiated. And of course, if they are uncorrelated, then it gets depotentiated, so it gets weakened. So that's the fundamental idea of Hebbian plasticity that associates activity of the neurons and translates their activity to their synapse.
Mhm.
That's why we sometimes refer, when we think about Hebbian plasticity, we sometimes talk about associative memory because we
Mhm.
associate things, associate activity of neurons and so on.
Yeah.
So if we think about that way of storing information in synapse, as I said, in working memory, the idea originates, of course, from this original of these earlier ideas of how long-term memory works.
Mhm.
So somehow this view, I think, provides a more unifying perspective on memory. We
Yeah.
can use similar principles to store long-term memories
Yeah.
and short-term memories. But
Exactly.
again, you pointed out something very important. Well, long-term memory is like the long-term potentiation. This takes long time, right? This takes like
Mhm.
days, months to express and last. In short-term, in working memory, as we discussed in the very beginning, we don't have time for this.
No.
We need to do it now and quickly. So the idea would be that this expression of memory in synapses would happen on very, very short time scales.
So like less than a second.
Yes, yes,
Mm.
yes. And frankly speaking, we also have to we have to admit that there is not so much biological evidence for it.
Okay.
There's a
Yeah.
growing pieces of evidence here and there. People start observing that there is some changes in the synaptic structures on short time scales, but this piece of evidence are still very scarce.
Mm. Okay. So let's let's worry about evidence later.
Yes, let's put it aside. Yes, I
so
agree.
so now focus on the ID. So that the idea is that you sort of induce this thing with a handful of spikes that arrives at the synapse.
Yes, the idea would be that you make neurons. This, if you remember again, we go back to the idea of cell assemblies. So
Mm.
you have different population of neurons. Let's say again, we go back to the idea of apple, pear, and banana. So we
Mm.
have this population of neurons that encode this information. And then, of course, the question is how these memories get into there in the first place. But if we assume they do exist in there, in this network that stores short-term memory or working memory, then the idea would be, of course, that you just reactivate by the cue, by the stimulus, and this subpopulation of neurons connected via this potentiated synapses gets activated.
Okay.
And here the idea, of course, would be that you don't actually have to activate these specific memories if you want to keep information in there, because information is in the synapses.
Mm.
So the idea would be that the activity of neurons, it's only a readout mechanism. It's not a mechanism to store information,
Yeah.
right? So
Mm.
it's also important to mention, because sometimes we forget about this. Often people forget about this, that these synaptic working memory models, they can actually act as persistent memory models as well,
Okay.
because you can make them persistently active.
Yeah. Okay.
But we understand that this, activity is not the mechanism to keep information; it's just expression of information.
Hmm.
So you might as well
Okay.
keep them quiet and yet have a memory.
Hmm. Because it's, I guess, I mean, if you think of this, I mean, the models without synaptic plasticity, right? In some sense, the models with synaptic plasticity is, if you sort of have a very long time scale plasticity, it is like changing the connectivity, right?
It is very
Yeah.
much so.
So it's like in some sense the recurrent network models, or this
Yes.
is sort of like a special case of the synaptic plasticity models.
Absolutely. So these are still recurrent networks, and
Mm.
as you said, they just have changes in the synaptic connectivity induced by a specific, architecture of the cell assemblies. So you
Mhm.
need to actually put in there. The nice
Mhm.
thing is that you can actually now store multiple memories,
Okay.
and you can use those multiple memories for the task.
So you store them in like different groups and different cell assemblies, or different.
Well, and again, as we said, cell assemblies would encode memories, but the
Mhm.
information about them would be stored in their connections.
Ah, I see.
Right? So
Yeah,
now when we have a delay period, we don't have to get everything active to maintain that information. It's there, sitting
and because
inside.
in the synapses. Yeah,
Yes, yes,
that I understand. Yeah,
yes.
so
And the memory
so
is
that's
quiet, in a
yeah.
sense.
So this is what you call silent working memory,
Yes,
right? Yeah,
yes. This is the notion of silence.
yeah. So that sort of shows why you can have working memory without any kind of apparent persistent activity.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
just
yes,
stored in the.
yes.
Mhm.
And here, one of the important aspects, of course, is also something we mentioned in the beginning when we talk about persistent activity, that it was good to store one memory. And a lot of
Mhm.
experiments early days, they actually were like a very simple, single
Mhm.
memory
Mhm.
experiments.
Yeah.
Now, when you go to more complex experiments, and specifically those that actually make us or monkeys store multiple memories because they
Mhm.
need to act on them after this delay period, the synaptic memory is a very nice candidate for it because you can
Because
actually
you.
store them.
Mhm. Because you can have much more storage capacity in the synapses than you can in the
Yes,
persistent activity, because these neurons involved in the different sort of memories are, well, the neurons are involved in several memories, so they would be
yes,
confounded in
yes.
if you just looked at the persistent activity, but not in the synapses.
Exactly, exactly. So you could have the same neurons even, they
Mm.
could be overlapping,
Yeah.
right? And it does not really messes up what memory it is because memory is
Mhm.
encoded in synapse or it's stored in
Mhm.
synapse.
Yeah. So okay, so okay, so that's it's certainly an appealing idea, and so that's one thing that is more natural. I mean, this silent working memory. And okay, so how do you implement this? I mean, for the long term memory, we know this spike timing dependent plasticity (STDP),
Yes,
which I guess sort of comes from the late 90s, and now there's many where then it only sort of mattered, the plasticity depended on the pre and post, the timing of the pre and post synaptic spikes, and now you have a bit more complicated rules with like three factor rules and so on. So is this the kind of thing you're thinking of, or but just that it's sort of like on a shorter time scale?
yes, yes. Along the same lines. Along the same lines, there are different learning rules, but essentially, you want to have a rule that would correlate activity of the pre and postsynaptic neuron, and depending on that correlation,
Mm,
set up either increase the connectivity or conductance of a synapse, or decrease it. So if it's correlated or anti-correlated.
mm,
STDP has its own phenomenology, right, and has been derived from experiments specifically in hippocampus, long-term memory context, and so on. There are other rules, I think, more powerful,
mm,
but it's in the same family. Yes, that you
mm,
associate activity of spikes on pre and post synaptic terminals, and based on that of correlated activity, you set up the synaptic strength.
mm. But if you look up a textbook on like synaptic plasticity, right? I mean, you have this on a short time scale. You have this short term facilitation, and you have short term depression.
Yes.
which is in some sense different from this STDP kind of long term kind of thinking. So is this the kind of rules you're thinking of, or is this something?
Yeah. So
Because I know that this is like at least it's sort of like this short term depression on some synapses, right? With the second, if there's a second spike, incoming spike, just coming out quite immediately after a first spike, then the synaptic response, postsynaptic response is smaller.
yes. So now we're getting into a various different implementation of the synaptic working memory
Okay.
models. Um, because it's not only the Hebbian, you mentioned short-term depression facilitation, there's the whole zoo of the synaptic effects,
Mm-hmm.
short-term effects. If we think about Hebbian, we always think about associative. So it means it involves both pre and postsynaptic activity.
Yeah, let's stick with the Hebbian first.
Yes. So for that, indeed, you could have potentiation of synapses, or you could depressing or depression of synapses. Though typically there's a lot of discussion in the field as to what extent you learn rather than depotentiate synapse or along with the potentiation, how much you can actually also help with inhibition. So to what
Okay.
extent you can learn inhibition also in similar way, or rather how you
Learn
can make
inhibition, meaning that
and you can also have
that the
the
synapses can weaken.
yes.
Okay.
That's one sort of school of thought
Yeah,
which is still
because
happen.
that's important in this STDP rule, the spike timing dependent plasticity rule for the
Yes,
long time
yes,
memories, right?
yes. Again, little evidence for this.
Okay.
Other ideas that we also pursue some of
I
these
mean, it's
ideas.
little evidence for it in the short-term working
Yes,
memory. Mm.
yes. Other ideas would be that what you do is you actually learn, like we would call disynaptic connectivity.
Mm.
So you
Okay.
strengthen the connection between the neuron that is inhibiting another neuron.
Okay.
So in some sense, you have this like a secondary stage that controls the amount of excitation and inhibition on the other neuron. So this is where you can control both excitation and inhibition by
I
just
see.
playing with excitatory
Yeah.
synapses.
I see. Yeah. Yeah.
But this is all in the kind of in the realm of indeed Hebbian plasticity. And yes, it's all about I think it's all about really strengthening certain synapses and weakening and other synapses indeed.
Because I remember when I talked to then Anders Lansner again back in like 20 years ago about this, he had been suggesting this something called the BCPNN rule, the Bayesian Confidence Propagation Learning Rule,
Yes.
and for me this sounds like a quite abstract thing, and but have you worked on this or?
Yes, in
Yeah,
some of my models, some of my
yeah,
PhD students they use that rule as well. Yeah.
yeah. So what is this rule? Maybe can you explain what it means?
Yes. So the idea of this rule is that it's also Hebbian, of course, but the way you set up your weights is derived from the Bayesian formalism.
Okay.
So what you basically do is you assume that there is certain conditional independence between the activities coming to a certain synapse
Okay.
on a presynaptic side, and
Okay.
then the postsynaptic neuron learns the posterior.
The learns the posterior.
Yes.
Okay.
So,
Now you're
so, I mean,
talking.
to cut the long story short,
Now
really,
you're talking base again.
yes.
What is
Let's
that?
talk about yes. So the cut long story short, you learn some form of association again, joint
Mm,
probability of activity between
okay.
pre and
I see.
postsynaptic, but you put this into the sort of umbrella of Bayesian learning.
Okay.
But the idea is similar that if you have evidence on the pre
So
and
it is.
postsynaptic side, then of course joint probability becomes strong,
So
and that
yeah.
means that the synapse becomes also strong.
So it's a Bayesian version of some correlation rule.
Yes, absolutely. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. We have
Okay.
extra
Between a pre and
components.
postsynaptic. Yeah.
Yes, and this Bayesian aspect has extra very attractive components. That it's also that you learn so-called intrinsic plasticity of neurons. So
Okay.
neurons have tendency to have their excitability levels controlled.
Okay.
So some
Yeah.
neurons in the cortical sheath they are kind of more excitable. Some of them are less excitable.
Mhm. Yeah.
There's a very strong evidence for this.
Okay.
In most of the Hebbian learning rules, we don't touch this. We only
No.
look into synapses.
Mm. Yeah.
Whereas this Bayesian needs to touch it because Bayesian also learns these priors. So
Okay.
how likely it is that a certain neuron will fire,
Ah.
and
I
that
see.
that prior is very important. because
Ah,
it sets up the stage for how which neurons get wired and how strongly they get wired.
ah, yeah. I see. That's cool. Yeah, because of course this, if you think about the self-regulation of excitability, has
Yes,
to do with not only with synapses but also with, I mean, just sort of like the translation of or transcription of these active ion channels in the
absolutely.
soma, and
Yes,
this is somehow you get out. This sort of becomes incorporated.
yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Oh.
This becomes a factor, and you can
Oh.
actually learn this. We call it a bias, and it
Okay.
quite nicely in the very abstract models. It quite nicely corresponds to this notion of weights that we have in
Hmm.
networks like artificial networks. Go back to
Hmm.
70s, 60s. You had weights and you had biases.
Hmm.
So the
Okay.
weights would be those Hebbian components of the BCPNN
Okay.
associative components, and the
Mm.
bias would be this intrinsic plasticity prior of the Bayesian.
Ah, I see.
So in one go, you learn both.
Oh, you turn the prior, you train the prior also in some
You
sense, or
learn
you
the
learn
prior
the
as well.
prior.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. You learn
Yeah.
it from the data, from the activity patterns of those neurons.
Ah, cool. Yeah,
Um,
it's interesting. So it actually has more. It has more function built into it, maybe. I mean, more sort of like, yeah, function than the traditional STDP rule, which is more about the
yes,
physiology and the physics, and
yes,
like
yes,
not
yes,
more
yes.
independent of what the network is actually doing.
Yes, and introduces a lot of nice behavior also if you
Yeah.
translate this into the spiking networks, because it's an abstract learning rule, phenomenological,
Mm,
but from the very abstract sort of Bayesian formalism, you can actually translate
mm,
this into spiking world.
mm,
And one of the very nice features is that it's also in spiking in SDP, for example, you need to use extra mechanism, so you prevent from this runaway excitation problems, instability problems, where the neurons fire, and then the weights grow, 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 grow. So you have different
mm.
kind of mechanism to prevent from this happening. In
Mm.
this BCPNN learning rule, it happens automatically
I see.
because you can control this balance between the biases and the weights.
I see.
So quite
Hmm.
naturally, you actually maintain homeostasis in the system.
Huh. I see. Two for the price of one, or
Oh
whatever.
yes, oh
Yeah.
yes. Plus, you can also quite nicely map
That's what we
the
like.
negative rules, right? The
Yeah.
negative weights as well.
Okay. So this then, of course, then does this also allow for like encoding of new objects,
Of
or?
course, because it's a Hebbian rule, right?
Yeah.
So it's still correlation. We still learn this
Yeah.
associative joint probability.
Mm,
So obviously, if there is activity coming up on both sides, then you will learn that
mm.
synapse should be stronger.
But what about sort of like, isn't there some kind of, I mean, you see something for the first time, like a one shot, I guess, one shot learning.
Yes,
Is that so that if you see some kind of, okay, so if you see an object you've never seen before, really strange fruit that we don't have in the north, then it still can be stored in working memory.
yes,
And that something which is this, I mean, because that is difficult to do maybe in this traditional recurrent network models.
yes, yes. So I will not go into the whole, like, of course, cognitive aspect of it. A
Mm,
lot of discussion, entorhinal cortex involved, and so on and so
mm,
on. But on a very simplistic way, if you think about it, you have a novel object, and let's say we want to encode a novel object in memory.
mm,
Then yes, then you have to have a mechanism that allows you to imprint this object into your working memory. Um, and yes, and Hebbian plasticity in this respect becomes a very convenient tool.
I see.
If you
Yeah.
don't have that tool, then it's very hard for you to build new cell assemblies.
Mm,
Some people would argue you don't need to build new cell assemblies because maybe cell assemblies exist in prefrontal cortex
mm.
and you just use them.
Okay.
And then you don't need Hebbian
But
plasticity.
they had to be associated with particular memories.
Yes, and they would associate them with other things. But then, of course, the question is whether they associate them with a long term memory or with a
Okay.
hippocampus and so on. Yes, of
Yeah.
course. This
Yeah.
notion of association at some level has to exist.
Yeah,
But
exactly. So
may,
just maybe at a different level. That's maybe
yes,
what the
maybe not
argument.
necessarily in building the actual cell assembly in the cortex.
Mm,
But if you follow the Hebbian idea of synaptic plasticity models, working
mm,
memory models, this is what you believe in, that indeed you build this new cell assemblies by means of Hebbian plasticity.
mm. So and then so if you think about this BCPNN rule, Bayesian Confidence Propagation Learning Rule. It's not the snappiest name, but that's
I will not comment on this, okay?
yeah. So maybe Anders shouldn't become a used car dealer or something. He's not.
Yes.
Anyway, so and then so what is then the so you have this BCPNN rule, and so what is the functional functional unit? I mean, it's like you have some cell assemblies, and they are maybe thought to be in some kind of a cortical column or something, or what are sort of like the has this been has been like specific suggestions on this?
So now we go to the example. Now to go to a slightly different question, because
Okay.
the learning rule, of course, is like SDP.
Mhm.
You could use it for whatever associative learning you want to think of between the neurons as
Okay,
such.
so BCPNN is a special case of STDP.
No, I would say it's a special case of Hebbian
Okay,
learning rule.
exactly. Special, yeah, exactly. That's
Like
what I meant.
SDP is another type of Hebbian
Exactly,
learning rule. Yeah,
exactly. That's
yeah.
what I meant. Mm, yeah.
But and then what we do is we actually want to go a little bit deeper, and we want to map working memory to the actual neural cortical substrate. So we don't want to
Yeah.
think about neurons just floating, in
Mm,
space. If you look
mm,
at the neuroanatomical evidence, it seems that they don't float in space completely like
mm,
this. So they
mm,
have these cortical columns.
mm,
And then, indeed, what we would associate this Hebbian learning would be with with a recurrent connectivity across the cortical sheet. And the best candidate for this seems to be superficial layers of the cortex,
okay.
because these
Mm,
layers seem to be quite well horizontally connected.
mm,
Whereas neurons in other layers of these cortical columns, they would have different connectivity patterns and not necessarily so nicely mapping towards this, distributed cell assemblies that could be a substrate for working memory
mm.
cell assembly.
Huh. And and at the synapse level, I mean, this BCPNN, it's sort of still like the NMDA and like the it's again a kind of I mean, if you look at these, yeah, how is the so anything particular things that is needed to implement the BCPNN rule compared to other like as like the STTP rule?
So it's similar. You still have some time constant, right? So you need to
Yeah.
have some time constant to integrate activity, to consider this
Mm.
activity, like the average activity, to consider how much it's correlated.
So NMDA is probably useful.
And then NMDS is
Well,
useful, but also AMPA too.
yeah,
So we
but AMPA
actually,
is such a shorter time. Yeah,
yes,
exactly.
yes,
But NMDA provides the longest time scales, right? At least
yes,
compared to
yes,
AMPA.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. So you kind
Mm,
of use the interplay of, again, AMP and MDA, and it shows to also provide you quite nice excitatory
mm,
inhibition balance in the system together with
mm,
GABA receptors. So altogether, these components allow you to keep a nice dynamics of the system and
mm,
can be mapped to learning rules, indeed, with
mm,
the time
mm.
constants that are biologically plausible.
Mm. I also read that it's like the blocking NMDA with ketamine, I
Yeah.
suppose that this is a blocker, actually critically affects the working memory
Yes.
performance. So maybe that's an indication that sort of like the for this Hebbian ID.
It's one of the indications, but at the same time, we have to be careful here, because if you remember when we talk about recurrent these reverberation circuits,
Yeah. Mm,
without much of the synaptic Hebbian
yeah.
plasticity, NMDA was also an important player in terms of keeping the balance.
Yeah.
So one
Exactly.
could argue
Keeping it
that if
stable.
you throw away NMDA, or you affect NMDA, you distort the balance. So therefore, you also distort
So,
this.
exactly. So NMDA is actually needed for all models. It
Yes,
seems.
yes, I think so.
Especially, yeah.
Yes.
And you also said that this like this as well short term plasticity is difficult to study. At least the kind of Hebbian ID is difficult to investigate experimentally. So why is that? It's you cannot do it in. Yeah, I guess yeah. So why is that difficult? I mean, you cannot do it in slices, probably.
Yes, so I'm not experimentalist, but from what I've read and what I've been thinking about and discussed also in different papers, what's been discussed, like
Mm,
the major problem is twofold. So first of
mm,
all, in the classical SDP long-term potentiation, let's call LTP, you need
mm,
to have you have these protocols of inducing it, right? You provide
mm.
this very strong synchronous activity, like burst of activity,
Yeah.
and then you wait, things get expressed, and then you observe the synapse how it gets potentiated. So this will
Mm,
not work here, because you need to operate on short time scales. That's
Mm.
one problem because you need to still, provide a strong burst,
Yeah.
but the parameters of this burst are not very well defined.
Mm.
And the bigger problem that I see, and better sort of rational or rationalize with, is the one that it's very hard to read out from synapse, because if you want to see if the synapse gets potentiated,
Mm.
you need to send the current and see
Mm.
if the response on the postsynaptic side is stronger or weaker. Just by doing this, you change the content of memory.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's this problem with Heisenberg's cut. You perform
Oh,
observation measurement which affects the experimental.
it's actually called the Heisenberg cat. That was a fun
Yeah,
Heisenberg
well,
synapse.
yeah, there are those cuts, right?
Yeah, that's real. It's more like Heisenberg synapse.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, exactly. So, okay, so exactly. So it's maybe. Do you think optical techniques could help? I mean, that's now we have like
Yes,
a new.
yes.
Yeah.
I think they could help. They could definitely help. You could tag. You could be more specific, and you would see things expressed in different ways than by pure spiking activity.
Mm. Mm. Yeah.
So there are options, and I know even in Japan, people have been sort of making attempts at testing this short-term associative memories in the
Okay.
context of short-term memory.
Hmm.
So I think there's
Oh,
kind of building momentum, but I don't want to say that there's a strong evidence because I
no.
haven't seen any yet.
No. Mm. So, and then now we talked about like the Hebbian synaptic plasticity, fast Hebbian synaptic plasticity. But there's also a candidate called non-Hebbian plasticity
Yes,
and non-Hebbian synaptic plasticity. So that what is that about?
right. So as we mentioned, there's a whole zoo of phenomena that takes place at synapses, right?
Mhm.
Another one is, as you said, non-Hebbian, meaning that we do not need activity on both pre and post-synaptic side.
Okay.
So typically, we would talk about presynaptic effects,
Mhm.
like connected to synaptic facilitation,
Okay. Mhm.
augmentation. So that
Yeah.
means basically that if you stimulate synapse for long enough, strongly enough, that synapse gets potentiated.
The presynaptic side.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, 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 yes. So it's
But
less.
you would think that, I mean, one thing that happens when you fire a lot on the presynaptics, I mean, then you run out of neurotransmitters and vesicles. So that should be depressing rather than facilitating.
Yeah, so you have two effects indeed. So on the
Okay.
one hand, you have the whole biochemical cascade that would actually increase the release probability of
Mhm.
vesicles. On the other hand, you're absolutely right. You deplete the actual
Mhm.
transmitter. So
Yeah.
that's why we have synaptic augmentation facilitation, but we
Okay.
also have synaptic depression.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
they're present at the same time. It turns out, and that's what actually been claimed to be a basis for this new type of, or a different type of synaptic working memory, that the facilitation outlives depression.
Ah.
So it
So
just
that is something.
lasts longer.
Yeah. Exactly. So some kind of increased intercellular calcium or whatever,
Yes, yes,
something like
yes,
that.
yes. This voltage, this yes, calcium
Okay.
dependent. Yes,
Hmm.
and of course, if it outlives the depression,
Hmm.
then it leaves a more permanent mark on the synapse, kind of a trace of memory in the synapse.
Hmm.
Of
Okay,
course,
which lasts longer.
it
Exactly.
yes, and again, if you look at the literature, then it's the whole zoo of time
Yeah.
constants and names.
Yeah.
So people would call it synaptic facilitation, something that happens on the order of up to 1 second or something, and then
Okay.
anything beyond that they would call synaptic augmentation.
Ah.
Uh,
Okay.
and there would be different candidates, biochemical candidates for this.
Mm.
But we do observe in experiments indeed these effects. And for example,
Mm.
augmentation is observed up to 5, 6, 7 seconds.
Mm. I see.
So it seems like a
Well,
good candidate to breach those synaptic
this is
activity.
something you see in experiments. That
Yes,
is, yeah,
yes.
because that's in slices, I guess, when you
Yes,
can sort of do
yes,
this.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes. And if you can imagine, if you have the synaptic augmentation, which lives, let's say, for 7 or 5 seconds, and
Mm.
then if you remember how long the delay periods were, we talked about before,
Yeah.
on the order of a couple of seconds, you could think of
Mm.
this as being a mechanism to keep the memory in a synapse to survive that gap.
I see. Yeah. Well, but you also then need, if you want to remember something longer than 5-10 seconds, right? Because you can do that, right? In your, if you sort of
Yes.
whatever relearn during, if you sort of if you need to if you need to learn a phone, or to remember like a telephone number, 8-digit telephone number for half a minute, you can probably do it by sort of retraining or whatever, remembering or something. So that would be, so that's maybe not so easy to make sort of compatible with this ID. At least then you need another assembly, or well, I don't know. Maybe
Well,
this is.
this is actually where we come to a very important thing. We talk about, before we talked about multiple items kept in memory by
Mhm.
keeping them spatially dislocated, right? If you remember, and I mentioned that it's not so stable and so on.
Uh,
Now we talk about actually temporal multiplexing.
okay.
So we actually, what you could think of if you want to store for a longer period of time, you could think about refreshing this memory.
Yeah. Exactly.
And if we think about refreshing, then we go back to the idea of getting neurons active.
Yeah.
Because only
Okay.
by getting neurons active, by sending these spikes through synapses, we can
Ah.
renew kind of the credit of this 5 seconds.
Ah. I see.
So then that's why we call about the whole idea of replay.
Okay.
So in the literature, you can read about something called working memory replay, and that would roughly correspond to the fact that you have this cell assemblies,
Mhm.
getting temporally activated, and then of course decaying activity and synaptic trace remembering about them, where other cell assembly gets kicked in and gets played. So if you
Okay.
then look into the delay period, you see kind of the temporal or like multiplexing. One cell assembly gets active, then another cell assembly gets
Mhm.
active, and then another one.
Mhm.
And this allows you, of course, that refreshing those synaptic traces over longer periods of time.
Mhm.
Interestingly, now, if you look into this activity of these multiple memories being multiplexed in time, guess what happens if you average over trials?
I don't know. So what? Can you repeat the question? I was.
Yeah, so if you have this reverberating or cell assemblies one after another, so
Mhm.
one cell assembly, then you have another cell assembly, then you have another cell assembly getting active on individual trials, within the
Mhm.
individual trials. What happens if you average across trials?
Yeah. Then you get everything, right? And you get.
Yes, you get
Yeah.
kind of person activity almost,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Everything becomes active on average.
Yeah. I see. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So there are some hypotheses, speculations that could be one of those
Mhm.
manifestations we observe in early recordings in monkeys.
Mhm. Yeah. Cool. So with this non-Hebbian ID, that also allows for learning of novel items, or
No, unfortunately not.
okay,
It builds on a fundamental assumption that we have those Hebbian cell assemblies in the network.
okay,
And
yeah,
then, of course, working memory only kind of boils down to reactivating them,
mm,
not
yeah,
to actually encoding them into that cortical sheet.
mm. So cool. So then you need some other mechanism to get the association to begin with.
Yes.
There's also, I mean, I think you sort of also alluded in one of your papers to this, that this Hebbian plasticity allows for sort of nice connection between sort of like working memory or short-term memory and long-term memory, that is somehow sort of join up in the same cell assemblies, or something, or
Yeah. So the idea, of course, is here. There's been growing evidence, and I think I don't think I'm saying something controversial here. If you look into the whole brain, and if you
mm,
look at the activity, the delay activity,
mm,
of course, it's not only the prefrontal cortex that gets activated. Like the whole
mm,
brain lights up in a sense.
mm,
So obviously the substrate for working memory is more distributed than we previously thought. Um, and this is not controversial, right? Because it goes back to this idea that what working memory could be doing is could be reactivating to some extent, these long-term memories.
mhm.
That of course implies that we don't store the semantic content of information in the prefrontal cortex.
Okay,
That content is in the long-term memory. And we
yeah,
only sort of activate, you could say, an index of it in
ah,
working memory.
yeah, exactly. So this is, and something goes back to this thing we started talking about, how this working memory could sort of like hijack, maybe it's not like a right word, but at
Yes.
least take advantage of the long-term memory stored in this, say, for example,
Absolutely.
in this Hopwell. Oh, that's
Absolutely. And the Hebbian beauty is that you could think of Hebbian being a mechanism
mm,
that associates these indexes in the prefrontal cortex with
mm,
long-term memories.
yeah,
And at the same time, being a substrate for building cell assemblies in the prefrontal cortex itself.
mm,
So you get this kind of a unified perspective of how the memory model, how memory system could work using this Hebbian associative principles, operating, of course, at different timescales.
yeah. Hmm. Cool, cool, very cool. So, okay, I thought, I mean, we've covered most of the thing I'd like to, wanted to, I've learned a lot, but I saw that you wrote one paper, I think, where together with, Earl Miller. So I guess that was sort of it was a paper came out in 2016 or something, which had a title Gamma and Beta Burst Underlie Working Memory. So that was a quite bold title, and I guess that was based then on some experiments
Yes,
in in the maybe in the Earl Miller lab. I would guess.
yes, yes.
Yeah. So what is the so yeah so what was the idea there? I mean, now we're talking about so gamma and let's sort of unwrap it. So gamma and beta bursts. What are these things?
So we should go back in a second for the synaptic working memory,
Yeah.
because this is where it starts. I mentioned this temporal multiplexing, right? That you
Yeah.
have these memories popping up during the delay period, different memories, and this being a mechanism for maintaining in replay. And in our early model in 2011, we actually did that without Hebbian plasticity, only with this synaptic augmentation, non-Hebbian. It worked very nicely. And then, of course, we repeated this in Hebbian. It works similarly. The important thing is that these biophysical models, they also have a very nice manifestations in terms of field activity. So you're the specialist here. So
Yeah.
the substrate for this spiking actually is also seen in local field potentials,
Yeah.
and it's seen as the gamma activity,
Yeah. Gamma is that's high
high
frequency,
frequency activity.
which is in, I guess this was in monkey maybe, or
Yes, yes, this was in monkey. Yes,
yeah.
yes.
And then this is so what is gamma there? Like 30, 50, 60 hertz or something?
Yes, it's anything beyond, I would say, 30, 40 hertz. Yes.
Okay.
It can be even higher. It could be even up to 100
Yeah.
hertz, very
And
high.
beta is
And beta would be probably something around, from 20 to 30 hertz,
okay.
around that place. But the nice thing is, if you look into our previous models, is that we could actually observe that wherever you activated cell assembly, it was associated with the gamma activity of the local field potential, seen in local field potentials. And again, it's nothing controversial because it's been studied also that, this interaction between inhibitor exciter neurons, it's a substrate for gamma bursts,
Yeah, that's sort of
localized.
like all this different many models that has explored this.
Yes. So of course the idea would be that if you have persistent activity and you have the exciter neurons being active and controlled by the inhibitory circuit, you'd have this like a persistent gamma band activity, right?
Okay.
Like
Yeah.
corresponding to the persistent activity of neurons.
Yeah.
So this was the first question we went into this experiment. I mean, to actually analyze the data. The data was already existing, and we, together with Mikkel Lundqvist, we had this kind of we posed the question whether we can see this persistent gamma activity. Our hypothesis was that you wouldn't be able to see it because we
Okay.
thought, indeed, if it's synaptic basis for memory, you should only see this periods of gamma associated with this replay of individual memories.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
this gave the rise for our, the whole analysis of how the gamma manifests itself in single trials during the delay period in working memory experiments. And we did observe indeed that the gamma is nothing but it's definitely not persistent. It manifests itself in this really short-term bursts, like 3, 4, 5 gamma cycles max.
Okay. So a burst doesn't mean like it's like meaning like short periods.
It means here short period, yes. So it's not like a burst of spikes.
No.
It's actually the short period of gamma activity.
I see.
And interestingly as well, if you look at the beta oscillations, the same story. Very short lasting. So I think that paper was one of the first ones that actually demonstrated and pointed that this interplay between gamma and beta It's a very solid correlate of the delay activity in working memory tasks.
Cool. So, I think you've done an excellent job in presenting the pros and cons and arguments for different kinds of models, what different kinds of models can do and cannot do, which I think is much appreciated. That's the kind of guest I'd like to have when I'm not an expert in the field myself. So I'm sort of relying on the guest to give a fairly balanced view. But now you can forget that for a while, and so now I'm going to ask you: so, what candidate model do you find most likely to be true?
Yes, so nowadays, of course, working memory is a quite hot topic. So you have more and more recordings, more and more pieces of evidence coming on, and more complex tasks. So obviously, we need to have much more flexibility in those models than we previously have thought.
Okay, so there's much more. You think there are more than one model? Are there many models that has some truth to it?
Yes. I think there are a lot of mechanisms to use here. Currently, we're actually looking into the synergy of different associative Hebbian and non-Hebbian synaptic plasticity, and we observe a very sort of a nice synergies between them.
Okay.
So they increase the robustness.
Okay.
But on top of that, of course, there's plenty of other interesting phenomena. The working memory is not only about storing information during the delay period.
Okay. No.
It's about actually using that information, recalling. You need to at the right time use the information. You need to remove information. You need to work with this information in the storage, not only store it and then read it. And of course, this begs for more flexibility. So currently, actually, we've been looking at different ideas of how this could be implemented. I still strongly believe in the attractor models.
Yeah.
However, I don't think the fixed points are so fixed as we think. So I think these models have to much more dynamics.
Meaning, like it sort of has like attractors which are more like limit cycles.
Or I would say quasi attractors. So short-term lasting stable points.
Yeah,
there could be limit cycles. The question is, of course, of how long is the limit.
Yeah.
But they need to be short-lived. They need to be very easily manipulated by both the intrinsic dynamics of the system, but also by the external cues. And increasingly, we also see now, we've been working recently on the new kind of theory behind working memory, rather its control, is that the spatial aspect of network may also play an important role. So far we've been thinking about the cell assemblies being like abstract, having abstract physical location. We didn't care about the location, distributed somehow. But
they cared a little bit about it when you talked about these columnar models.
We do, yes. But how one column and another column, how they collectively store this memory, we didn't care about the co-spatial locations.
No.
But now when we have increasingly more pieces of evidence coming from the interesting tasks where, as I said, you have more dynamic use of working memory, it seems that there is a lot of interesting phenomena in how you actually use this memory. For example, for different tasks, when you dynamically have to switch a task and yet you use the same working memory item, how do you do that? What is the neural correlate of that information? Is it the same population of neurons that fire for the same item but in different tasks or not? And it turns out not necessarily.
So the typical tool you use is sort of like, spiking neural models with many neurons?
Yes, that's our typical tool because it's very nicely connect them to data.
Yeah, and also then this what's called the BCPNN.
Yes, so BCPNN comes on top of this as a potential mechanism to quickly bind the cell assemblies. Yes.
Yeah, cool.
So you can incorporate different ideas, but I think altogether there's like a mixture of many ideas that have to come together and explain working memory.
And you can include these you can have like both the BCPPN and say non-Hebbian learning rules in the same network, so you can explore sort of.
Yes.
So you have like a system where you can sort of explore all these different ideas together.
Yes. So currently, actually, we're working on the paper where we're trying to put all these different mechanisms, synaptic mechanisms, together in different combinations and then we subject models to multiple different battery of tasks,
Okay.
and then we can compare to which combination are most robust in the scenarios. And not surprisingly, it turns out that the combination of Hebbian and non-Hebbian ideas is very powerful.
Mm. But you need, I mean, this is sort of spiking neural models. So I guess that's like integrate and fire type models, or?
Yes.
Yeah.
So in the past, we used more complex models, neural models, but we soon quickly realized that yes, point neurons are sufficient to
That's
explain
sufficient.
this
Yeah.
phenomena.
Yeah. So you think, yeah, exactly. So there's no need to go to more like Hodgkin-Huxley style biophysical detail models at the present stage.
Not for type of analysis we do, right? I will not
Yeah.
make a big claim here,
Yeah.
because if you remember also from the last PhD thesis, there's a lot of interesting phenomena happening on
Yeah.
a lower
Absolutely.
level, and they could explain some, processes that we model on the network level, like
Yeah.
these dendritic potentials. They could actually explain some aspects
That's
of
true.
intrinsic plasticity, for example.
Yeah. That's true. And if there's some kind of cellular mechanism behind it, like a neuronal bistability,
Yes.
and then this also needs to be included.
Yeah,
But
but I
maybe
think a lot you can
yeah.
explain by network. That's just
Yeah.
my point.
So, but I mean, maybe it's. I mean, if you often work. I mean, working in neuroscience, especially if you have like a training in physics, or then you sort of you're very happy when it seems to be some kind of principles that are used many places.
Yes.
And I guess these attractor networks, they seem to be like they could maybe then just be the key ingredient of all kinds of memory, not only both long term and short term.
That's my belief. I would share that belief. That's a hypothesis. Yes,
Yeah,
I think it's quite powerful. And if there's been recently a very nice review paper in Ilya Fiet lab, and where she argued for attractor dynamics to support a lot of other computations in the brain as well.
yeah. I remember actually now that I was when I started doing neuroscience. Uh, that was like switch from like condensed matter physics. So I attended this methods in computational neuroscience and like course in Woodsole, of a fantastic course, 4 weeks. And one of the organizers were David Tank,
Yeah.
and he sort of so I don't know. I remember he asked me. So he says, I don't know. At least he sort of, I remember he said when we had a discussion, I mean, what else could it be than attractors? I mean, but not only, I mean, the whole sort of how do you do computations sort of without attractors? So I didn't have much to insight to bring to the table at that stage. But I just remember the statement, and I guess that sort of that's 30 years ago. So anyway, so that's food for thought. But I think before I let you go, I would like to ask you something that I'm not quite sure if you're too interested in, but this the possible role of molecular memory in this. We had this podcast with Sam Gershman, podcast number 14, which is sort of this like he's like one of the scientists who is exploring this idea that it could be a molecular component to memories in addition to the synaptic component. So what do you think of this idea?
So first of all, of course, the role of molecular, let's say, molecular perspective is huge. Specific, well, it's for both synapses and for intracellular. I think the power of his idea, or the novelty of his idea, lies in the fact that he talks about molecules, intracellular molecules, right? That I think
Yes.
that's the whole idea.
Mm,
So first of all, he talks about long-term memory,
mm,
right? And his idea would be that, and that's I think something new, is that the actual semantic information, the content, is
mm,
stored in neurons, indeed, in
mm.
molecules, in intracellular molecules, and that synapses would be like a mechanism for reading out stuff,
Exactly.
right? So that's his
Mm.
idea.
Yeah.
I think it's quite interesting, specifically if you look from this perspective of this free energy principle and Bayesian inference, because then you quite
Okay.
nicely connect both learning and inference. So synapses
Mm.
are for inference,
Yeah.
and for storing stuff is the neurons. I'm not sure how much evidence for it is. I watched that podcast some time ago, so I don't remember the details. I
Mm.
think he pointed out to some biological evidence behind.
I think there's some like some strong pointers when it comes to I mean to very simple animals with
Right.
very few cells and something. I mean, but and some kind of coarse memory of things like things
Yes.
to avoid and so on.
Yes.
So, but I don't know. But at least I'm happy that this avenue is also
No,
explored.
absolutely. There needs to be, of course, some very, very good differentiating experiments to be done there. He, I
Mm,
think, suggested some, and then he claimed that in some cases, actually, it's in favor of his hypothesis.
mm.
I think it's an interesting avenue. Surprisingly, I haven't seen much of the follow up in the field.
No, I think it's yeah. No, I don't know.
Maybe it's a fresh
It's
thing.
it sort of has been, and maybe there are also sociological things that makes it difficult to fund this kind of research. I mean, there's also lots of, as we all know, there's a lot of fashion involved. I'm not saying that this is the case. I mean, but in general, there's a lot of
True.
fashion involved in the way we sort of distribute money because it's
That's true.
the ones which are sort of considered successful are the ones that are asked to sort of give out new money.
Yeah.
So there's like some kind of hysteresis there, obviously. But anyway, so I don't know. But
I
well,
think it would be. I mean, it would be very interesting to hear more about this, and see how the experiments maybe support this on the purely computational from the computational perspective. The Bayesian inference is very attractive, obviously,
yeah.
and he also makes the argument that the Bayesian inference becomes somewhat easier or neater with this
Mm.
implementation.
Yeah, it's also interesting. I mean, this idea that like theories which we like and find beautiful are the ones we root for, and which is fine. And this has been turned out to be successful in some parts of physics, where obviously the most beautiful equations or the candidate models with the most beautiful equations turn out to be true. But it doesn't mean that it's. But it's more fun to work on beautiful ideas
I
and
think it is,
principles.
and I think that's
Yeah,
the beauty of science as well,
yeah,
and the science made by humans still,
yeah,
not
yeah.
by AI.
So,
That we
but
have the sense, I think, of beauty, elegance, and our
yeah,
preferences.
yeah. So that could gives us a bias, which is maybe helpful
Sure,
or maybe not.
I think different biases they sum together in the population.
That's true. That's true. So that's true. Okay, Pavel, it was a great pleasure to talk to you. I certainly learned a lot. So thanks a lot for coming to the podcast.
No, pleasure is all mine. Thank you very much for invitation, and I must say it was an absolute pleasure to talk to you. I mean, your question very nicely guided the discussion, so I really appreciate that. Set up the
Well,
stage beautifully. I
thanks
truly
a lot.
enjoyed it. Thank you very much for this.